Hello, good evening, and welcome to BASWA's Digital Summit Day. My name's Jane Shears. I'm Head of Professional Development at BASWA, and I'm really pleased so many of you can join us for this webinar. On our Digital Summit Day today, this is the third webinar we've been running, and it launches the BASWA's Continuing Professional Development Programme. And hopefully you'll see on the website now we have a number of events to book into, ranging from some talk days to webinars, and there'll be something available through the programme every month. So this webinar is a celebration of the International Day of Older Persons, and we'll consider the importance of social work with older people and why this area of work needs particular expertise, and also what current developments are happening in adult social care that impact on us as social workers with older people. I'm delighted to be joined by Jerry Nosowska, who is currently BASWA's Chair of Council and also Founding Director of Effective Practice, which is an organisation that supports others to improve social care. We're also joined by Pete Felden, who is a freelance consultant and trainer specialising in the CARE Act. He has a background of working in social care as a social worker, trainer, manager and policy developer. And Pete is also chair of BASWA's Policy Practice and Education Group for social work with adults. The webinar will commence with a presentation followed by a discussion and question and answer session. And the plan for you tonight is that we really hope that you'll join in the webinar and be interactive through the chat drop-down menu on your screen. And you can send your comments throughout the webinar at any point. Please specify if you have a particular question, if there's a particular member of the panel, either Pete or Jerry, that you'd like to direct that question to. So it would be great to hear from as many people as possible this evening. Following this webinar, we'll have the further communication. The webinar will be recorded, and the accompanying resources and links and the PowerPoint presentation will be available. If you're a BASWA member, you'll be able to download your CPD certificate in your member area up to 48 hours after the event. For non-BASWA members, you'll need to contact Stephanie Davis, who will be able to arrange for a certificate to be sent to you. You'll also find handouts in the drop-down for download, but these also will be sent to you post-event within 48 hours, should you wish to refer to them in the future. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jerry to begin the presentation for what next for social work with older people.
So I'm just going to say a few things about the International Day of Older People, which is a United Nations Day, 1st of October every year, and that was decided in around 1990. And that was followed very quickly by agreeing the United Nations Principles for Older Persons, which was adopted in 1991. And there's 18 principles which cover a whole range of different areas of rights for older people. So they start with independence, which is thinking about access to income and care and housing. Participation, which is around integration of older people into society and their occupation. There's a set of principles around care, which includes health and social care and human rights, which fits really well with social work. There's a set of principles around self-fulfillment, so the opportunity for older people to develop their potential and to access resources to thrive and live well in society. And there's also an area around dignity, which is about upholding dignity and ensuring that there's no abuse and that there's no ageism. So those principles kind of lead us really nicely into thinking about what's important in social work with older people. So why we need social work with older people, why this area of work requires social workers and their expertise, and also thinking about current developments in adult social care.
So you may be able to use your arrow keys to put it forward, Jerry.
I'm afraid they're not showing up at all on my screen. I'm really sorry about this. I know that they should.
The arrow keys on your keyboard.
Okay. So, oh, that seems to have worked. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so those are the United Nations principles for older persons. And as I said, they're around independence, participation, care, self-fulfillment and dignity. And then we've got the things that we're going to cover now. So I'm going to talk about the importance of social work and the kind of capabilities that social workers need, and then hand over to Pete to talk about developments in adult social care and things that are impacting on social work with older people at the moment. So why is social work with older people so important? Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that older people are the largest group of adult social care users and of the NHS. So I'm going to primarily be talking about the English context, but many of the things that I'm talking about have very strong parallels within Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. So thinking of BASWA as a United Kingdom organisation, there's a lot we can learn from the other countries, but there's also things that we have in common. So we have a lot of older people requiring care and support, requiring healthcare, and that population is growing, and the complexity of needs that older people face is also growing. One thing really to bear in mind, of course, is that older people are a very varied group. There's a kind of common approach that older people sort of are defined as people aged 65 and over for the purposes of services, but of course there's a massive difference between the experiences, the needs, the wishes, the aspirations, the kind of well-being and outcomes that different older people will have. So we do have to bear in mind that we're talking about a very large and diverse group. We also have to bear in mind that many older people are carers as well. And so social work with older people is really about maintaining independence, well-being, dignity, and a full life right up to the end of life across a very varied set of circumstances. There are particular considerations around working with older people because of the life course. So there's been a lot of research done, not enough really, around social work with older people, but a really useful resource was put together by a group of academics who have a particular interest in social work with older people. And you'll find in the drop-down handouts the capability statement for social work with older people in England, and that's got references to the research. And what that shows is that through the life course, there's a number of things that have a bearing on the kind of practice that's required to work well with older people. So the first thing is that older people do face particular complex situations and needs simply arising from the fact that they've lived a long life. The second thing to bear in mind is that there is a really cumulative effect across the life course. So for example, experiences of poverty or oppression have bearing through the life course and kind of accumulate as you go along. So an older woman, for example, born in Glasgow is likely to live 12 years less than a woman born in Kensington, Chelsea. So we have to bear those things in mind. And the third area to bear in mind is that there is ageism as well. Older people face particular discrimination, and that applies not just to general society, but also to our own services. So we have to really bear that in mind. And those kind of complex issues are ones that social workers can really grapple with because they have something quite unique to offer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is social workers have to offer. It's social work as we know it with all groups, but I think there is a little bit more here as well. So social workers are expert at building relationships, and we're building relationships here with a very diverse group, having to understand really diverse and complex situations. Coordination of services, and with older people very often there are a lot of different services involved. There's different networks, there's different communities to bear in mind. We have particular skills and knowledge that are recognised in statute, in the law. So within the Care Act, and bearing in mind that older people are the largest group of social care users, There's a recognition of the social work role. There's a recognition of that role to a great extent within the Mental Health Act and within the Mental Capacity Act as well. We can provide a really holistic biopsychosocial assessment. So thinking about the whole history of the person, their particular social circumstances, but also the spiritual and emotional area of work. And of course, if we're thinking about approaching to end of life and the sorts of losses and changes that can happen, that's really important to have that emotional and spiritual element to it. I think the complexity and the uncertainty of that stage of the life course does really bring out some of the capabilities of social workers really strongly. And of course, working within integrated services, social workers have the position and the opportunity to really uphold the social model and to recognise not just what the individual's needs are, but the complexity of the circumstances around them and the impact of structural barriers and structural kind of oppressions around older people as well. So, you know, to my mind, older people and carers should have access to social work support when they need it. So there is also some really useful research about the kinds of impact that social workers can have and the difference that they can make for older people. So this slide just shows some of those areas, highlights some of them. So around prevention, thinking about reducing the need for care and support, responding to particular issues that older people face, like maybe falls, changes in mobility, changes in cognitive function, those kind of things. Strengths-based work, obviously trying to support people to maintain their independence, manage their own risks, and enable them to continue to be occupied and take part as much as they can and they want to. Thinking particularly about support for carers and bearing in mind that a really large proportion of carers are older people themselves, and that relational change that happens as people enter a caring role, thinking about how we ensure that relationships continue, and also recognising that there might be safeguarding elements within relationship changes and within changes in power in a relationship. There's a lot of evidence around the therapeutic support that social workers can offer. So I've highlighted that in its own right, but also thought about that in terms of supporting people through change. So when people have a change in their physical abilities, when people's lifestyles change, as they retire, as their roles change, as they experience bereavement, there's a lot of work that social workers can do there. There is some good evidence around social workers supporting people to avoid avoidable hospital admissions and to get home more quickly. And some places are actively ensuring that social workers work in hospital departments, work in A&E, in accident and emergency, and work in GP surgeries as well. And there's been some really interesting work from North America thinking about sort of problem-solving therapy, helping people plan ahead, helping people identify solutions to current difficulties, but also thinking about how things will change, and to prepare for those changes and the impact that that has in terms of helping people to manage their futures themselves and stay in control of their lives. So I want to talk a little bit about the capability statement that BASWA led on creating for social work with older people. Again, this is a document for social workers in England, but it does have resonance across the whole of the United Kingdom. And this quote came from an older person who was involved in that project. So I'm just going to read it out. It's important that it isn't assumed that anyone can work with older people. Older people deserve to have people with the right knowledge and skills working with them. Some of the knowledge and skills is the same as for working with other people, but there are specialist elements too. And that was really powerful actually to hear that from an older person, and to recognise that although as social workers, part of one profession, we have shared capabilities, and we have the professional capabilities framework in England that shows all those domains. You can probably see it lurking behind the quote on the slide. There are also particular considerations around each specialist area of social work. So for older people, what the capability statements does is take those domains in the professional capabilities framework and think about what's additional, what's particular, what's specific to working with older people. So if you take the example of communication, all social workers, as part of their skills and intervention, will have really good communication skills. But we also need to bear in mind that with older people, there might be particular barriers or needs around communication or particular expertise required. So, for example, if you're communicating with someone who's had a stroke, people who have dual impairments around sight and hearing, people who maybe have dementia, who are living with cognitive issues. So thinking about those specific areas, and of course, one of the big themes in the capability statement is the social work role around rights for older people and combating ageism as a particular structural oppression that older people face. So what the capabilities statement does is it sets out those specific knowledge, skills and values that social workers will need working with older people. And it does that at 5 levels, 5 points in your career. So there's some essential capabilities for people as they finish their education as social workers, they finish being students. There's some particular things that hopefully people will have acquired as they finish their assessed and supported year in employment, so their first year as social workers. And there's some things for people to think about when they're at the advanced level around overseeing practice with older people, and at the strategic level in terms of developing and improving social work practice with older people. But the primary area to think about is the experienced social worker level, because that's where you'll have acquired, through working with older people, the range and the specialism. So that's where most of the capabilities are focused. And if you look at the statement, you'll find that the 9 domains are really described in detail for that area of work. So it's not a mandatory statement. It complements the professional capabilities framework, and it's endorsed by the Department of Health and Social Care. It's created by social workers with older people, and it really reflects the evidence and research around what matters. And so one of the most useful things about it is that it helps to describe what it is to be a good social worker with older people. And that's something that you can use not only in your own practice, but also to share with older people to show this is what social workers do, and with other professions as well, to help to recognise the social work role. So the way that it can be used is to go to the capability statement and think about what level of practice you're at. Are you a student? Are you in your first year of practice? Are you an experienced social worker, or are you in an oversight or strategic role? And think about those capabilities and how far you meet them. What are your strengths and what are the areas of development? And then alongside it, there's a continuing professional development pathway. And what that does is it suggests professional development opportunities, ways that you might learn and develop to help you develop those capabilities. And it also looks at the kind of support that you might want to help you, and also the way that you might show your social work practice, the evidence that you might gather to demonstrate that you are experienced at working with older people, and the impact of your work. And again, that's not mandatory evidence, although for registration we all have to collect evidence. It's really helpful suggestions coming from social workers themselves about how they can develop and how they can show that. And what we really hope is that through thinking about those particular capabilities, learning and developing and gathering the evidence, your own practice as social workers with older people will be better recognised, because it is such an important area of social work. We really want people to see it as something they want to do, and something that they can get recognition and appreciation for. There's also a website that helps with learning and development, and that's gsw.ripfa.org.uk. So that link is also available in the handouts, and that was put together again by the Department of Health and Social Care. The GSW stands for Gerontological Social Work. So it was put together by academics who are also practitioners, who identified a really helpful case study to help you think through what social workers offer to older people and what we can do to make a difference to their lives. So I suppose to summarise that kind of why social work matters to older people and what social workers can offer, I think I just wanted to say that it's really important that as a profession we take a lead on what social work with older people looks like. There's a lot of discussion, Pete's going to talk a bit about the discussion and the debate that's going on around what social care should look like, what older people need and what the government is prepared to offer and what resources are going to go into that. But I think from us as a profession, we want to make sure that social work that we provide is ethical in that it's developed based on evidence and what older people want and need from us. So it's not ideological, that it's expert. So it's kind of really focused in on the capabilities that we can provide as a profession, drawing on the social model, drawing on our theory and our knowledge. And because of us doing that and showing the impact of our work, it will be really trusted. So ultimately, older people will ask for and want social workers to support them.
Oh, right. Okay, that's me.
Yes, please.
It is, right. I'm going to say something about the challenges that social workers who work with older people, indeed adults, are facing, and how BASWA is responding to these challenges. So there is more need to be assessed and met, mainly because, as you know, there is a growth in numbers of older people. But what's interesting is that the percentage of older people asking for help has reduced. I'm getting this information, as you can see from the reference at the bottom of the slide, from Social Care 360 provided by the King's Fund. This is a very useful online data set that provides you, that aims to provide all the data and information you could possibly want about adult social care and the different groups within adult social care. So the proportion of older people approaching local authorities for support actually fell by more than 2% in the period, 2-year period 2015-16 to 2017-18. But because the population has actually been growing, as you know, the actual numbers of people requesting help had grew, and it grew over that period of 2 years by 8%. There is some speculation that this fall in numbers of people asking for help could be due to the rising number of self-funders, but it may be more complex than that, and research is needed. The reason there's a rise, one of the reasons why there is a rise in the number of self-funders is simply because the threshold of £23,250 hasn't increased since 2010-11. If it had increased in pace and kept pace with inflation, it would now be nearly £3,000 higher. Okay, Jerry, next slide.
I would love to.
Well,
yeah, okay.
Oh, sorry, Jerry, I do beg your pardon. Can you just go back to the last slide? I made a mistake, sorry. Well, the second part of my slide is about that last sentence, about there being a significant amount of need amongst older people that's not currently being met. This is, I think, an issue that we're always trying to grapple with. I mean, there are 3 possible reasons for this. Firstly, research indicates that some older people are not having their potentially eligible needs adequately met by anyone, simply because they haven't been assessed. So there are some people who've got potentially eligible needs, but they're not being met because they haven't been assessed. How they manage, I don't know, but that certainly research indicates is the case. Second situation is, although the Care Act means that anyone with an eligible need there is a legal duty for the local authority to meet those needs. There is evidence that in some circumstances there are needs that have been overlooked, so in those circumstances they've been unmet. But the third scenario is where there is undermet need, and this is where it is thought that the personal budget is not sufficient to meet people's eligible needs, and this can occur where a social worker's professional judgment is not being given enough weight in determining what is sufficient to meet their needs. So addressing undermet need is about improving practice. We'll talk more about that later, but also when we're considering addressing unmet need, this is about stopping unlawful and bad practice, which does exist, as we will see. Okay, and I'm definitely ready for the next slide now. Okay, this is expenditure patterns for all adults, not specifically for older people. And again, it's from that very valuable resource that I referred you to from the King's Fund. And although more money has been put into social care, you will know from your own experience that it's not enough. And certainly the King's Fund projects that there will be a funding gap by 2020-21, next financial year, of £1.5 billion and rising in the following 10 years to £6 billion on current expenditure levels. The recent public debate has been focusing on the needs for more funding and reform of the system. For example, Labour's policy of offering free personal care. But any change is going to be maybe a long time coming. And meanwhile, there are consequences of insufficient funding to deal with. And this is BASWR's priority. Next slide, please. So here we have two quotes, which are actually from the Ombudsman, but they neatly summarise the impact of insufficient funding on both people with care and support needs and social workers. So the first bullet point there, I developed some of the points there in an article that I wrote for PSW, Professional Social Work, in May of this year. And I made reference to some of the frequently occurring examples, which include imposing maximum periods of respite care that do not follow the statutory guidance, making unwarranted restrictions on the types of circumstances where direct payments could be used, and also, quite common from the Ombudsman, reducing packages of care without a reassessment of needs. The Ombudsman was also made in that second bullet point, references to the impact that has on frontline staff and what needs to happen. And certainly BASWR is responding to that, and we are developing guidance to help with this process of challenge, and I'll say more about this in later slides. So I can move on to the next slide. So as the Ombudsman said, these financial pressures are they're impacting on social workers in some ways by causing a conflict with the BASWR Code of Ethics. Social workers are understandably concerned about applying local policies and practices that may result in need being unmet or undermet. To some extent, these ethical concerns can be addressed by improving the way that professional judgments are made, but there also may be concerns about the way that decisions are being made and that the requirements of the legislation and the statutory guidance are not being followed or, at worst, being subverted. Certainly, some social workers experience this scrutiny and challenge to their professional judgment in an unsatisfactory way. For example, being told at the final stage of the process that the proposed care and support plan costs too much and this is certainly very difficult to explain to people with care and support needs. So moving on then to my final slide, which sets out some of the things that BASWA is doing through the Adults Policy and Practice Education Group, which I chair. So one of the things that we're working on is sort of picking up the issues around developing an ethical approach to meeting needs. We're working on some guidance, which is just at the draft stage at the moment. So the aims of this guidance will be to suggest actions that local authorities could adopt to support social workers in making decisions that are in accordance with social work values, in accordance with the social work values that are expressed in the Code of Ethics. Another aim is to address the circumstances where local authority practices are designed to reduce expenditure and are of ethical concern about the way that they're doing that. So, for example, blanket policies to undertake reviews where the review isn't required by the circumstances of the individual. Thirdly, to outline how the guidance can be used both at an individual level, but also as a basis for pressing for local changes to policy and practice. And what we also want to do is not just put out the guidance and leave it there for people to interpret. What we want is to support the implementation of the guidance by encouraging further debate about how to apply the recommendations, to provide learning opportunities, and also to support further research. So this plan, the detailed plan, is hopefully will come out for consultation in late January of next year, and then be shortly put into practice. Now, the second reference there is to something called the Future of Adult Social Care. Now, this document will be coming out for consultation later this month, and that's a quote from it included there. So one of the things that this document will have is a setting out how there ought to be more of a focus on well-being, and it proposes that the existing eligibility criteria should be revised. But as you know, the Care Out sets out the elements of well-being in section 1.2. There's 9 elements, and it's a fairly sort of good approach to saying what is meant by well-being, but it doesn't create a vision for what social care should achieve. So we're advocating that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons, their concept of independent living, be adopted as the standard of well-being against which needs should be identified and assessed. This would mean that all activity to promote well-being would be consistent with this standard of independent living, which is principally about ensuring or advocating that there are equal rights for all persons with disabilities to live in the community, and also that choices should be equal for people with a disability to those that don't. So that's going to be out for consultation later this month, and we're hoping that you'll read it and participate in the debate. Okay, thank you. Look forward to your questions.
Just before we go into questions, there's a couple of things I just wanted to cover as a sort of summary of the end. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was just bringing together some thinking about what might happen next in terms of social work with older people in England, but also thinking about that more broadly across the UK as well. So we have this slightly limbo situation at the moment in England where we're waiting for a green paper, which is now 2 years overdue, which was originally put forward as being a paper that will tell us what will happen to support older people. It became then a green paper around all adults, and much of the kind of debate and discussion that there's been around that has been around funding and how social care and support will be funded for adults in the future. But of course, there's a lot more to that, as Peter has just been talking about, around what are we trying to achieve with that care and support? What is our vision for the way in which all adults, but I'm thinking particularly about older people, will be part of our society in the future? So are we looking at promoting dignity and rights, supporting people to have choice and control, supporting people to live independently? And if so, how would we fund that? What's the best practice to go with that? And some of the things that people have reached quite a strong consensus of in this country and across the UK is that that should take place with within a kind of joined approach. And there's an important element of how our work as social workers and our work within social care integrates with health and with other services. There's also a strong element within that around safeguarding and holding people's rights and dignity, and a strong human rights element within that as well. And there's also a big question about how we support carers, how we support families and communities, and how we support the diversity of older people, because that population, as all populations across the UK, is growing in diversity and richness of experience, and we need to bear that in mind, recognise different identities, recognise the intersectionality of those identities, and make sure that our future care and support will be appropriate and work for that diverse population. So we had these question marks around where social care and where social work within that are going, but I think from our profession's point of view, we have a kind of strong evidence-based, strong experience and expertise, strong confidence and strong co-production around the need for that to be rooted in human rights, rooted in that concept of independent living, around choice and control, being part of a community, having the opportunity to thrive, and that within that, thinking about how we join up and make sure that people have a good experience of services is going to be really crucial. And I think social work will remain essential within that debate about what social care for the future looks like. So one of the things that I find really optimistic about social work with older people is that it's become much more recognised. And what we're starting to see is much more research being done around this area, much more recognition of the particular elements of it and the importance of particular capabilities in this area. And I hope that will grow and strengthen as we go along. I also just want to mention some of the things that BASWA is doing to support social workers in this area of practice, which kind of chime with what we're doing to support all social workers. I'm going to kind of focus in on older people's social work. So we have support for practitioners through advice and representation, through guidance, and through things like branches where people can gain peer support. And I think one of the things that's going to be really important, thinking about some of that, those moral dilemmas that Pete's talking about, some of those ethical dilemmas, some of the issues around practicing within a constrained resource context. Within that kind of situation, that context, it's really important that we do support one another and that people do get access to advice when they have struggles around what they're able to do at work. So that's one of the areas, obviously, that BASWA is really keen to support people in. Another really crucial area is learning and development around this particular area of practice as we learn more, as the more research comes through and as we gain in expertise. So alongside that capability statement that I've been talking about, there are some new resources that are available from today to help social workers in that practice. So there's a self-assessment to support you to think about your learning and development. There's a supervision tool. There's a tool that links the capabilities to some really useful video resources. There's one that links the capabilities to resources from NICE, from the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and the standards that they've produced. And there's also some really useful questions for leaders in this area, which you might want to look at if you are a leader in this area, or you might want to kind of bring to the attention of your organisation for them to think about. We will be continuing, obviously, with the policy work that Pete was talking about around the Green Paper in England, but also other policy work across the UK. And there's a lot of lobbying that goes on in Parliament. We support the all-party parliamentary groups around social care and social work, and we've been very involved in work around the Mental Capacity Act and the Mental Health Act. And our campaigns in BASW, I think, do tie into some of the things we talked about around support for older people. So the work we're doing to highlight the impact of poverty, bearing in mind that poverty across the life course becomes a really significant factor in older age. And the work around working conditions, because we know that demand within services for older people is going up and up. And also the work around relationship-based social work, because one of the things we hear again and again from the evidence and from our experience is that older people really value the relational work that we do. The move towards more customer-focused work and more virtual or remote sort of work isn't something that we hear from the evidence that older people really welcome, and for them it can often be more barrier to services. And within BASW, we are striving to kind of make sure that all the work that we do has service user and care involvement, so the lived experience, the voices of older people is really involved in that. So I'm going to hand back to Jane now.
Okay, thank you very much. That's been a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation, so thank you, Pete and Jerry. We've had a few questions coming in, so if I may, I'd like to share some of those with you. One of the things I'm taking from the presentation really is almost the position of social workers in kind of an ethically awkward position between professional decision making and eligibility driven services. And I'm just wondering whether maybe coming to you, Pete, first, if you think that social workers who continue to practice in statutory services have their kind of creativity stifled because there isn't that opportunity to really deliver person-centered social work practice. And maybe I can come to Jerry with the same question.
I think where we see differences between local authorities around people's creativity being stifled or their professional judgments being thwarted, if you like, is in what I referred to about the decisions that are made about the sufficiency of personal budgets. And there, in some local authorities, there is research evidence that social workers feel that their professional judgments are overridden, and indeed the Ombudsman makes reference to that. But the research also shows that in other local authorities, social workers find the process of challenge around the sufficiency of the personal budget as being positive and rewarding. But of course, as in the case with much of the social work that you do, there is very little detailed evidence about what is good practice, so that we can learn from it. You know, over the last 10 years, there has been less sharing than there used to be, and organisations that have arguably the responsibility and resources to do that don't. The most of the research data that I've got is from surveys that have been undertaken by Community Care, and I think a couple of them are referred to in the links that are available.
Okay, thanks. Jerry, did you have anything to add about that? So it's really about... Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so a couple of things thinking about the kind of practice dilemma within this context of limited time and limited resource. So some of the things that I find helpful to think about are, firstly, even within constrained time and constrained resource, we do know from older people that relationship is still really important. Honesty and transparency are really important. And so I think there is still scope for good practice around making a connection with people and being really open about what our role can be. So that would be the first thing that I would say. And there is scope around creativity from the strength-based approaches that are kind of being becoming very, very important across social care in this country. I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind with strength-based approaches when we're thinking about older people is that strength-based approach has to go hand in hand with a recognition of the oppression and the barriers that people might face. So we can be creative in thinking about the resiliences that older people have, the experience that they have, the strengths that they've accumulated across the life course, but we also have to bear in mind the things that have held them back and the experience of oppression they might have had. So there is some scope for creativity there. The second thing that I wanted to mention is the difference between a professional judgment and a kind of final decision, because I find that really helpful myself in thinking about how we explain our role as practitioners. So many practitioners have the opportunity to make professional judgments. So if you've done an assessment, you'd make a judgment about what the needs are, what the eligible needs are, what sufficient care and support might be. You may not, though, have the final decision. That might be ultimately a budget holder, it might be a panel, it might be someone else who signs off. And I think if we're really able to explain that in our work with people, with older people, with carers, then that really helps to empower them to make sense of what's happening. Because I think one of the difficulties that arises is where we feel as practitioners that this is what should happen, but then the decision is something different. And I think if we can explain that our judgment is that this would be the best option and the decision rests here, and then we can go back and explain that decision, then that can help with some of that that struggle. And the final thing that I would say is that I think there is something around which is really usefully described by some researchers as moral distress, which is where you know what the right thing to do is. It's not a dilemma as such. The right approach is clear, but it's not possible. And I think within the constraints that we face in social care at the moment, that can happen quite a lot. And when that sort of moral distress occurs, when we feel like we want to do this thing in practice and we can't, then it is very important to get peer support, to be able to discuss that in supervision, to be able to be open about that in your organisation, and to work together with social workers to support each other with that, and to try ultimately to kind of work outside of those employment structures to try to change things and to campaign for more resource.
Thank you. I'm going to try and run two questions in together for the next one. They do kind of go together a bit. They are a bit artificially squeezed, but there's a question about are older people's care and support needs changing? But there's also a question about in some of these sort of ethically charged decision-making practices, is it something about whether social workers are getting better at assessing older people's care and support needs? So it's running the two things in together. Are care and support needs changing, and or are social workers' assessments getting better at identifying what care and support needs are? Who would like to take that one first?
Shall I go, Sherry?
Okay.
Well, I don't think people's needs are necessarily changing. The way in which we view those needs, of course, is changing. I mean, the Care Act reshaped the way in which, to an extent, the way in which needs would be perceived, and delineates a number of concepts about the difference between needs, desired outcomes, etc. I think what social workers are getting better at is applying both the letter and the spirit of the Care Act, And I think, you know, by applying both the letter and the spirit in particular, this makes for better assessments of need and better care and support plans. However, having said that, the data from the recent annual report from the Ombudsman on complaints, of course, you know, the complaints that go to the Ombudsman are only a tip of the iceberg and not always necessarily a representative tip of an iceberg, but the complaints in relation to assessment and care planning, which is the category that the Ombudsman uses, the number of complaints are not going down. So either social workers are in some areas not getting better, or people are getting better at complaining. I'm not sure which.
So I would concur with Pete that the approach has changed in the way in which we think about needs. So with the Community Care Act, all of our thresholds were premised on risk. So people had a need and then we'd worry about what would happen if we didn't do something about it. Whereas with the Care Act, we have a recognition of looking at needs, but also looking at outcomes that people want to achieve. And then really crucially thinking about what, other than the local authority care and support, would help people achieve those outcomes. And I think that has meant that we've all been able to practice more at looking at strengths and having a more balanced assessment, and moving away from a deficit model and thinking about not just the problems, the worries that people have, but also what's working and what would help them. So I think social workers have always been good at that, but I think the permission and the framework to do that has been really enhanced. So in that sense, practice has improved. I also think that what Pete talked about around potential for unmet need is really important for us to understand, because it looks from the evidence, to my understanding, that people who would have got care and support previously don't get it now. So Age UK estimate that there's a gap that's grown over the last 5 years or so of people who would have had care and support and who now don't. And we need to understand whether that's because those people are doing just fine and have networks, or they're really not. And I think some of them really aren't doing okay. So that's something that we do need to understand, and we need to resource, provide the resources to meet the needs. But the other thing that this question has made me think about is that, yes, people are changing to some extent. The world is changing, society is changing, people are changing, the cohorts coming through and aging now are different than they've ever been. So that's something that we always have to kind of bear in mind as social workers, that our understanding of the people that we're working with, of what they might expect from us, of what their aspirations are, of what their identities are, is really important. So we do have to keep bearing in mind that we have to keep developing practice alongside the changing population.
Okay, thank you very much. I think a couple of things that I'm really taking from the presentation is about the activity and proactive role that social workers can have in this sort of really interesting field of practice. And we haven't talked much in the questions so much about developing our own capabilities and our own evidence and confidence in challenging and working with older people. I'm just wondering, as a sort of final note, if you could perhaps just tell us one thing you think, in your view, is the next key development for social work with adults over the next 6 months.
You go first.
Shall I go first this time? Okay. Yeah, I think it's the thing that springs to mind is the voice of social work within integrated services. So we need to be really confident professionally and in partnership with older people and carers of what social work offers, what our role should be. I think we do that alongside occupational therapists and other skilled practitioners within older people services. And I think that's particularly important at the moment to kind of reasons. One is actually 3 reasons. One is that integration is happening anyway. So how we ensure that we create the space for good social work and relational work and social model and human rights work within that is really important. And the second thing is that there's a competition around funding. So there's a lot of discussion about public funding in general, and I think the NHS is well understood, and we have a strong body of evidence that practitioners like GPs, for example, are under-resourced. And so it's really important that alongside that we talk about why social work needs to be there too, and make sure that as funding discussions happen, social work is recognised, social care is properly recognised. And then the third thing that's really interesting is the growth of social prescribing in England, and also the understanding of the importance of paying attention to social needs within health generally across the UK. So it's taking different forms. So for example, in Northern Ireland, there's models and pilots around having social workers in GP practices. Here, there's a lot of work going on around social prescribing. And I think it's just very important that social workers remind our health colleagues and the public and funders and the government that social workers already offer really good therapeutic social support, and that we can absolutely be delighted that other people want to offer social support as well, but we need to make sure that our expertise and our experience and the work that we've done around personalisation and co-production feeds into that, so that it's not developing sort of in tangent and separately, but it's really kind of integrated with the whole social model and the whole area of social care.
Thanks, Jerry. So, Pete?
Yeah, no, I would just add to that. I mean, I've been thinking about the question about have things changed, and some of the things that Jerry's just been saying in answer to that question. And what the whole debate about social care, of course, is dominated by money. It's dominated by how there needs to be more money in the short term, more money in the long term, and reforms to the way in which people contribute from their own resources. And this is a danger of drowning out the debate about what social workers do. And so in these discussions, what we need to make sure is that when there are, that we make sure that discussions are widened out and include the social work contribution to improving social care, in addition to just addressing the issues of money.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you very much to Jerry and Pete for an interesting discussion, and thank you to our participants online for bringing the questions to us to create that interesting discussion. As I said at the beginning, you will receive a recording and you have the documents to download that accompany the webinar and the presentation. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to everybody for being involved with us this evening, and I wish you a very pleasant evening later on. Thank you.